What's up, guys? Welcome back to the Strong.Sistas YouTube channel. Regenerative ag has been getting a lot of press recently, both good and bad. So I decided to chat with Dr. Richard Teague, who has produced a number of journal articles throughout his research career that demonstrate the science behind adaptive multi-paddock grazing, holistic management, how when managed properly, cows can improve soil health, repair our climate, reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So make sure you guys check out part 1, where we review the science behind how that's working. Now in this video, part 2, we're going to review some of the criticisms of regenerative ag and how Dr. Teague can respond or does respond to these criticisms. So I hope you guys enjoy. So I think if we can move on to some of the criticisms of regenerative ag, I think that regenerative ag is definitely being heard about more widespread, and it's being talked about both good and bad. And so if we could kind of talk about some of these criticisms, the first one is there's a limit to how much carbon that can be sequestered, and it's not permanently sequestered with regenerative ag. So how do you respond to that criticism?
Well, there's a number of aspects to that. Great question. And the research that we've just done in Mississippi, all the soil work was done by one of the best soil labs in the world. Professor Francesca, I forget how to pronounce her surname, her student Sam Mosier produced that the most of the carbon being sequestered in the AMP grazing, but not in the conventional grazing, was of the very longest lasting component. By far the majority was that long lasting component. So yeah, AMP is putting the right stuff in the ground. We have followed up in North Dakota and Saskatchewan, two of our leading guys, Neil Dennis and Gabe Brown. Neil, unfortunately, has passed. But we've been measuring for 15 years. The NRCS has been measuring for 15 years the amount of organic matter being put into the soil. It's risen every year. It is still rising. In some of the spots, it's up at 16%. The rest of the farm is at 12%. It started off at less than 1% 16 years ago. So is it plateauing off there? Nope. And we think that's about the level that was there before we started any of our shenanigans as Homo sapiens. So one of the pieces of science, what's lacking is science. And it takes a long time to get that kind of thing. So one of the things, the areas that's done the best research on this is by our English friends at Rothamsted Research, where they have studied this lot. They've been going for over 100 years, and they found it plateaued off. But you can go to the web and you can look at the experiment and you can see exactly how they managed it right the way through. So they started off by having sheep in a sheep system. Now, they weren't trying to show what fixes the most amount of carbon. What they were asking the question of is the system then was to graze with your sheep in a sort of rotation. And as soon as in the beginning of the season, you have to move them around to graze the whole area until the grass starts producing a certain amount. Then as soon as there was more there for the sheep to graze at the time, they would cut a hay crop and take it off. So when you cut a hay crop off, what happens to the soil carbon? It goes off with the vegetation.
Yep.
So it diminishes your soil carbon.
Yeah.
So that was a part of it. So at some years, they actually produced more hay than others. After it had been going for quite a long time, it became expensive. So they reduced the size of the study. And instead of having grazing by sheep, they then cut, okay? They take it off. They measured how much forage came off, and they would burn it for the carbon content, and they would throw all those nutrients and that back on the soil. So what do you think is missing there? In the UK, they've got 14 species of dung beetles. When they had sheep grazing there, or cattle, they had dung beetles. When they cut and put back, do you think they had dung beetles? Mm-mm. Okay. One of our best researchers on our team is Jonathan Lundgren. And he's up in South Dakota. So he has done work on the dung beetles. Dung beetles are big little critters, soil critters, okay? They dig little tunnels in the ground and bury their balls of dung. Okay. You know what that does to the general microbial population there and the fungi? It increases the biodiversity hugely because it creates new gaps for these other little critters, and they're adapted for that. Okay. And then you've got the old earthworms. As soon as you start looking after and not putting chemical fertilizers and pesticides on, earthworms just blossom. The best nutrition for plants is earthworm poop. Okay. So as soon as you move to an artificial situation, small plot where you're cutting off, it was after that cutting off that they started getting the plateauing effect. What if they'd left it with the dung beetles and everything there? So when we look at articles, all the studies, like we've got the Saskatchewan one, Neil Dennis's place, where it's still carrying on. You know what the dung beetle population, the soil microbial population on their places is? Absolutely phenomenal. So, yeah, it's the way that the research is being conducted. Yeah. And this, if you can get one thing through to people to try and understand better the difference and what's really happening, is to say, look closely at how the research was conducted. You know, scientists who live in their offices, they want an easy way to get a publication. So they will sit there and they will do these global analyses, looking at all these different things, and they come out with a result. So are all the results that they're putting in there conducted in the same way or not? None of them are the same. Okay. Yeah. So how can you really compare them?
Meta-analyses.
Yes, it's actually absurd.
Yeah.
But what's needed is specific hypotheses tested on the actual causal mechanisms.
Yeah.
If I do this rather than that, what happens to the soil microbes and the function that they provide? That's where the answers lie.
Yeah. So I think you touched on something that I think is really important for people to understand, and you brought this up in your papers too. Criticisms of regenerative ag, one of the points is, well, that carbon that you sequester, it doesn't stay in the soil for that long. And they kind of miss the context of the whole carbon cycle and how that's just like a natural process. However, there is a big change in the soil paradigm and the soil science right now. And people don't distinguish between the two pathways for forming organic matter, soil organic carbon, soil organic matter in the soil. And I'm not an expert on this, but I'm just going to briefly touch on it. So one pathway is called the particulate organic matter. And this is like, let's say you throw mulch out on your soil, you have a bunch of hay out there, your corn crops are so basically the pieces of decaying plants and animals go from top down into the soil. And so this is the called particulate organic matter. This is fast cycling carbon. Now, on the other hand, you have the mineral associated organic matter. And this is the type of soil organic matter that ruminants really are helping build, because they help increase the photosynthesis of the plants. And then the plants then feed the microbes these root exudates. And this goes through these soil microbes. So the carbon in the liquid form from the plant roots is going through the microbes. The microbes get big, the microbes die. That necromass, dead microbes, then becomes soil organic matter. And this is called mineral associated organic matter. It's much slower cycling. It has a lifetime of 10 to 1,000 years. And this is the pathway that ruminants are really helping build, because we're increasing, the cows, when managed properly, are increasing this amount of root exudates. And so these microbes can grow. We get more microbes. Those microbes inevitably die, and we have that soil organic matter. So this context of these two different pathways isn't discussed enough as well in the literature from my understanding.
So you really are on the ball. So you remember I said earlier, Sam Mosier's research showed that the long-lasting carbon was the greatest with AMP. Mm-hmm. The mineral associated organic matter is what she was reporting.
Okay.
So you're absolutely correct.
Yeah.
So, but the criticism of if you build up the carbon, but then change your land management to something else, you don't necessarily maintain that. So you've got to, as a goal, manage in order to maintain that carbon and that long-lived carbon in the soil.
True. Very true. Okay. So I think that's a good response there. Again, context is key. And like you said, understanding how people run the studies and whether they're considering these really important nuances is really important. And these meta-analyses that examine hundreds of studies that are all conducted in different ways, it's not fair to compare those results necessarily.
Exactly. If you can just get that, well, you've got to get that across.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. And then another common criticism is that, all right, we've got animals that cows that go to feedlots. They spend most of their life out on grass, and then their finishing stage, they go to a feedlot. And so there's a ton of animals in a small area. And so they're able to produce a lot more beef. So then a common criticism is that, hey, in order to implement this adaptive multi-paddock grazing where we need a lot more land so that we allow time to recover, it would require an unrealistic amount of land to feed the world this way. How do you respond to that criticism?
Where we've studied it, and I'll quote the latest study across Mississippi, the production from the land with AMP grazing was between 4- and 6-fold higher, with totally beneficial effects on the land. So the key is improving the function of the soil at the same time as decreasing your input costs and eliminating detrimental inputs. And at the moment, mainstream agriculture with their inputs is actually decreasing the potential of land to produce all the time, whereas regenerative cropping and grazing is actually improving it and improving the profitability of the people who are managing the land.
Okay. Well, and I think that I'll bring up that figure again. This one here. If we implement this on just 25%, we can see huge benefits. And it's unrealistic to assume and expect 100% of our livestock operations to move away from feedlots. I don't think that that's possible. And that's not what people are proposing. It's, hey, how can we implement this in 25 or 50% of our operations to see huge benefits?
Well, you're quite right, but there's another aspect to this. This is quite a complex thing. For the time being, the consumer in America wants a choice. So some people are going to choose the corn-fed, feedlot-fed, but then increasingly people are going to the grass-fed for health benefits and also benefits to the land. So we are finding that under the management that a person like Alan Williams is talking about and achieving with a lot of people, the gains on grass-fed can be as great as the gains in feedlots at much less cost and much less transport cost. So there's going to be an increase in that. Not everybody can do that. You know, East Texas and east of there, people can do that. West Texas, not so much. But we can produce weaners here in West Texas that we can actually ship east instead of shipping to the corn produced with irrigated water, which is a high carbon footprint as you can get, to actually get over that particular thing. So we're just the marketplace is going to have to sort those things out. But people have got to be educated to actually implement the changes that we need in that regard. But the other thing too is if you produced the corn that you fed to the cattle in a regenerative way, then so in the whole of the corn belt, we can do that, dry land without any irrigation at all. So you can have your pastures in rotation with your corn production that requires no fertilizer inputs. It just requires intelligent, and there are people doing it already. There's a German gentleman that I met at the Nobel Foundation 8 years ago. He's been doing it forever. He goes back to Germany where they're doing it there all over the place amongst his relatives, and they have been doing it forever. Their energy sources are, they capture the cow poop, okay? They produce electricity from that, and they don't lose the fertility because then the fertility just goes back on the land. Mm-hmm. It's a totally closed system that doesn't require energy inputs or chemical inputs or anything. We know how to do it.
Yeah.
But of course, it's industrial ag is going to fight that all the way.
Yeah, it seems like after the Green Revolution, after World War II, we just got this divide. And all right, you're either a rancher or you do cropping, and so the systems are separated right now. The millions of I don't even know how millions or billions of acres across the Midwest that are used for corn and soy monocropping that are barren for so much of the year. Why not integrate livestock into those systems, which can provide the fertilizer and the necessary, like, improve the microbes in the soil? And so you bring up a great point. One of the answers is, hey, let's use these acres of cropland that aren't even really suitable for cropland necessarily. Let's integrate livestock into those. And that kind of solves a lot of the issues. Like, we already have a lot of the land that isn't being used properly. We're not being optimal with our land usage. And so integrating those two can really solve a lot of issues.
One of the businessmen I'm working with to move things in that direction is a gentleman up in the Boston area who's working with scientists there. And by his calculations and his scientists, if you gave him Illinois to do what we're talking about now, permanent pastures with an override of regenerative managed crops, he could more than eliminate the total US emissions, as well as decreasing the food costs by about 30 or 40%. We know how to do it.
Yeah. There's no money in it for these bigger corporations, right? There's no money in improving the biology of the soil. So people are going to fight this because they make money on all these synthetic inputs. And if people improve the biology in the soil and stop relying on chemistry, then these bigger corporations won't be needed as much, such as Bayer or Monsanto Bayer Corporation. And then another criticism, we've kind of touched on this before, but I think this is probably one of the biggest issues that we're currently facing, and one of the biggest messages that we want to provide counter evidence to is our grasslands would be better without. So how do you respond to that? Like, they claim that without cows, without ruminants, we would be better climate wise.
It is palpably false. And we have more than enough. I mean, it really is extremely false, because you lose all the functions. You see, it's not just climate change that is the only ecosystem service that we require to extend life and human life on this planet. It is healthy water, healthy watersheds, biodiversity, and all these things. Having animals there managed appropriately is the best way of ensuring that. The counter to that, of course, is managed inappropriately. Yes, they're a huge problem. So the people who have got livestock actually have to take, they have to be accountable, and they have to move so that people can't, with honesty, accuse them of that.
Yeah.
That's a huge point to get across.
Yeah. I want to say the study said, there's a study that says it takes 500 to 1,000 years for nature to build an inch of topsoil on its own. Is that right?
It's absolutely wrong. You see, there's no knowledge in that. It's pure emotion. We've been measuring people who adding 5-6 inches of topsoil in 20-inch rainfall areas just through regenerative agriculture. Yeah. Now, part of that is actually making the soil less compounded, where you get the life back in it and it sort of bounces up again. But over and above that, the guys who are putting in hay above that at the beginning of winter and grazing it, at the end of the next summer, that layer is 6 inches below where they put it. It's actually soil above that, because earthworms, they chow down on all that organic matter. They produce soil, actual soil, at an incredible rate. So in dry areas, yeah, going to be slow. In wetter areas, hey, it's really quick.
Yeah.
See, building back soil life isn't different to the geological breakdown of rock into soil, which is what they're referring to. And the two go together.
Yeah.
Not one or the other.
Right. But I think, so it takes a really long time for nature on its own to build soil. When we incorporate livestock and manage them properly, we can see much faster soil growth. Like you mentioned, Gabe Brown has seen 4, 5, 6, I don't know, crazy amount of soil growth just in the last 10, 15, 20 years. And so ruminants can help accelerate that. And I think it's a really important point. We are not at the luxury to be sustainable. We have degraded our soil health so much that we can't just say, okay, we're going to pause and let's now implement sustainable practices. We have to be regenerative. We have to regrow topsoil. There's a difference between sustainable practices and regenerative. If we implement regenerative for a number of years and regrow our topsoil, sure, then we can be more like sustainable focused. It's not one or the other. Those two should be incorporated together, but we can't just have sustainable. We're not at the luxury because of all of the destruction we have implemented with industrial agriculture the last 100 plus years.
What kind of mindset wants to sustain a degraded system when we know how to improve it?
Yeah.
You summed it up well.
Okay, so now let's review some of the publications that claim that regenerative ag can't achieve everything that people claim that it can, and it's a little bit hyped up. So I'll bring up one by Dr. Brisk. So let me bring this up. So the Savory method cannot green deserts or reverse climate change. So this is a response to Alan Savory's TED Talk a number of years ago, where they discredit the potential of regenerative agriculture and holistic management. So when you receive criticism from these types of papers, how do you typically respond, or what do you think the shortfalls of these counter arguments are?
Okay, so in the same journal, I wrote a letter pointing out the shortfalls of Brisky's understanding of the subject. And basically, all the research that he quotes does not take into account that the larger the area being grazed, the more heterogeneous the impact on the land. Animals, even though they've got a very, very large area, they won't graze evenly over the whole area. They select certain spots and graze them into the ground. The researchers worked on very small areas, so they don't pick up that difference. But it's very evident on any commercial scale ranch. The other point is, in range ecosystems, they're generally dry, and changes in factors like soil carbon change very slowly. And most research is done over 3, 4, 5 years, and that is not nearly long enough in these dry areas to actually pick up any changes. So it's what they call an error 2 in science. In other words, the difference is there, but you just didn't pick it up. If they had carried on and done their research, you see, we insist in our area, which has got moderate rainfall, of having treatments down for at least 10 years before we know we're going to pick up a difference. If you go dry like New Mexico, you have to go for 20 or 30 years to pick up a difference, which we've done. However, the converse of that is if you go across the Mississippi, in 3 years, you get huge differences because of the extra rainfall. So the length of time research has been conducted, but probably the most critical issue is the people who have managed to have the best results have had training that makes them superior managers. They know how to manage, and they know how to look for early signs of, hey, this isn't working. I can see that this area here has actually got less litter cover, i.e. more bare ground this year than it did last year. So they change their management. That is the key of adaptive management. Researchers don't do that. And they don't manage for the best outcomes with a given tool. Whereas the AMP grazers, we've worked with ranchers who've shown how to make it work. And they have 100% interest in making it work as well as possible. So they make it work as well as possible. Researchers don't do that. And if the researcher is inherently biased against it, he's definitely not going to make it managed as well as it can be. And that's exactly what's happened. So those are just the major reasons why. And we've located these differences from here up to Canada. When we look across the fence at conventional, light or heavy grazing compared to the amp grazing has come out ahead in 99% of the cases.
So I'm going to share one more PDF. So this was the infamous Grazed and Confused by the Food Climate Research Network. I think this was published when 2017. And I read through some of this, and basically what I think the summary of what this says is that they're regenerative ag and this they don't even use the term amp grazing. They say rotational grazing and holistic management. It's over talked about. It's not going to be able to live up to what people say it's going to achieve. And I did a Command F to search through this document for any of your science articles or Dr. Roundtree's science articles, and none of them show up. And you touched on this earlier, where you reached this point in your research career where you saw all of this negative feedback from people who are talking poorly about Alan Savory, and you had to come up with a different term besides holistic management. So AMP grazing, adaptive multi-paddock grazing. And this Grazed and Confused document, they do kind of like a literature search. And so I went to grad school and I did a literature search. And the way you run these literature searches is you're trying to get an idea of all the research that's been published in a certain area, make a conclusion about all the evidence out there. And the way that you do this is through keyword searches. And I think sometimes you can miss complete areas in a research field because you didn't use the right keyword search. And from what I can tell from this FCRN Grazed and Confused article, they must have just used holistic management keyword search and they did not use the AMP grazing. And so they completely missed all of this other research that's out there. And that's a huge issue because this is a really big document that makes a lot, I think that it, like a lot of policy leaders will be reading this and things like that. And so am I correct in that understanding?
You're absolutely correct. So this particular group, I know I've met many of them. I met most of them at the Paris conference on all these things. And they don't look for the counter view and try and understand the counter view. They just use existing literature only to actually forward their viewpoint without taking into account the other material that's actually been published. Now, part of the confusion is that using AMP grazing, people have not realized that it's the same as holistic, and they are searching for holistic management. Plus, there's a whole lot of people who are anti-cattle for other reasons. And when I went to school, they taught us, we had a debating society, and every week we would have a different topic that we had to address, and we debated in pairs, my pair plus the other people's pair. And week one, the one pair had to argue the case for, and the other pair had to do the case against. The following week, you switched those around. So both parties were forced to look at the other viewpoint and present it. That is what people do not do anymore. And how else are you going to arrive at what's really happening than by going through a rigorous process of looking at both sides of the equation? And that is what's required, is a rigorous look at both sides of the equation. We are coming out now, we had 20 scientists in our 14 discipline across the Mississippi study. Those are coming out now with the journals now. When that comes out, people will see that there's a substantial amount of information now available about AMP grazing and its benefits from independent schools. You know, A&M was just one of the schools involved, Colorado State, Michigan State, all over the place. So there's some heavy scientists that have got involved in this, and our results are extremely promising.
Yeah, I think that one of the biggest criticisms of Regen Ag is there's no science to support it. And I can confidently say now that's false. There is, you just don't know where to look. And you have to use the keyword search adaptive multi-paddock grazing and look at the research from Dr. Richard Teague, yourself, Dr. Jason Roundtree, Dr. Paige Stanley, Dr. Wayne, Dr. Gosnell. There's plenty of researchers now producing these research studies demonstrating the power of ruminants in repairing our ecosystems and repairing the health of the soil when managed properly. All right, I hope you guys enjoyed this 2-part series with Dr. Richard Teague. This is a really important message to get out there. So make sure you guys like, subscribe, send this video to friends and family. And until our next video, make sure you're behaving like an angel.